Hello everyone, it's me, John Lorden. Welcome to another episode of Brain Scratch Case Cracked. And we have a bit of a big one today. I think this episode's going to go a little longer than usual, so let's jump right in. Imagine you go out for your morning walk with your dog, walking past the Church of St. Margaret of Antioch in Barking on the eastern side of London, England. And you find a body in the church's graveyard leaning up against a stone wall. Terrible, right? Now imagine 3 weeks later, you're on the same morning walk with the same dog by the same church, and it happens again. And police don't consider it a serial killer case. This is the case of the Grindr serial killer, and I want to give a quick thank you to Brain Scratch researcher Babble Froggy, but in particular, her daughter actually sent this one in, so thank you so much to Babble Froggy's daughter. Barking is a suburban town in England with a population of 48,340 people. According to Wikipedia, in British slang, barking is short for barking mad. And barking is sometimes cited as the origin of the phrase, attributed to the alleged existence of a medieval insane asylum attached to Barking Abbey. On the 19th of June in 2014, early in the morning, someone called emergency services to report a man out on the street who had, quote, collapsed or had a seizure or was drunk. When police arrived, they would find the man to be dead. There was no signs of a struggle or any injury, but police noted that the man's top was pulled up, exposing his midriff, and he had been likely dragged. They also found a brown bottle with a small amount of liquid in it. His name was Anthony Walgate. He was 23 years old, a fashion student who on occasion also worked as a gay escort. Authorities would later figure out that he had died from an overdose of GHB. They became suspicious of the man who called emergency services, Stephen Port, especially when they found out that he lived in a flat right where Anthony had been found. They also found out that Stephen Port had hired Anthony from an escort service for £800 only a few days prior to him being found dead. Stephen was arrested and questioned. They took his laptop as well as DNA samples. After he was found out, Stephen insisted that Anthony had died from taking his own drugs, and Stephen had nothing to do with his actual death. He admitted to hiring Anthony and to having sex with him, and even moving Anthony's body after he supposedly died sleeping in Stephen's bed. Anthony's mother told authorities that Stephen Port was a murderer on 12 separate occasions, but they simply told her there was nothing to investigate. They were treating this as an accidental overdose. Stephen was released on bail, and even though he was facing a charge for perverting the course of justice, his social life would remain very active through the summer, and more bodies would be found near his home. A 22-year-old Slovakian named Gabriel Kavari wound up staying on Stephen's sofa as a temporary flatmate. They had met online, and Stephen wasn't charging any money for a place to sleep. On the morning of the 28th of August 2014, while walking her dog, Barbara Denham found the body of Gabriel Kavari in the southwest corner of St. Margaret's graveyard. He was wearing sunglasses. His clothing was pulled up to reveal his midriff, just as Anthony Walgate's had been. Authorities would later find out that he also died of an overdose of GHB. 3 weeks later, on September 20th, Barbara and her dog stumbled across the body of Daniel Whitworth, 21, from Gravesend, Kent. He was sitting against the graveyard wall on top of a blue bedsheet. The clothing on the top half of his body once again exposed his stomach like he had been dragged. Tests showed that a small brown bottle found with his body also contained GHB. In his hand was a suicide note, taking blame for Mr. Kavari's death, saying that he gave him too much GHB at a party and he just couldn't live with what happened. Police took Mr. Whitworth's death at face value, and no efforts were made to verify the note, which actually would later turn out to be checked and verified to be Stephen Port's handwriting. Some of the victims' loved ones, members of an LGBT independent advisory group, and journalists from website Pink News all raised concerns that there was a serial killer at large, and they tried to give those concerns to authorities, but they were told that there was absolutely no link between these deaths. 18 different accounts across 12 separate apps and websites have now been linked to Port. He used these to seek out sexual encounters, particularly with youthful-looking men, typically in their early 20s, known as twinks, and Stephen was killing them when he was done, but authorities just weren't believing it. Finally, in March of 2015, for obstructing justice in the death of Anthony Walgate, Stephen was charged and sentenced to 8 months. Unfortunately, they'd never considered that he could have actually murdered Anthony. Stephen would only serve a little over 2 months before being released in June, and it wouldn't take long for him to return to form. Stephen reviewed a lot of material online about young men being raped while unconscious. If police might have analyzed his laptop earlier, they could have figured this out and possibly saved some of these young men's lives. If they had analyzed the blue bedsheet found under Daniel's body, they would have found Stephen's DNA. If they had only followed up on a Facebook account named John Luck that was in contact with a prior boyfriend of Gabriel Cavari, they would have also found that John Luck was Stephen Port. At an inquest into the deaths of Gabriel and Daniel, a coroner noted bruising under Daniel's arms, likely caused by him being pulled around prior to his death. Police had no answer. She also asked about forensic testing being done on the bedsheet and the bottle found with Daniel. No testing had been done. The inquest ended with open verdicts, officially questioning the police's version of what had occurred. What's amazing to me is that this case gets cracked at all, but it still wouldn't happen fast enough. Jack Taylor was 25 and a local forklift truck driver. On Saturday, September 13th of 2015, he left a local nightclub after drinking. At 2 a.m., he was contacted on Grindr by Stephen Port. Within 36 hours, Jack was found dead. He was found propped up against the opposite side of that same graveyard wall. His shirt was pulled up over his belly, just like the others. A syringe was in one pocket and a small brown bottle in the other. Police did not regard the death as suspicious and seemingly treated it as yet another self-inflicted overdose. Jack's family did not agree and started their own investigation. They found out about the other victims. They tried to convince police that there was more going on here, but they just wouldn't agree. The police, however, did let Jack's family know about some CCTV footage that showed Jack walking down the street hours before his death with another man. The family asked for police to release a photo of the footage to local newspapers and were told it probably wouldn't happen since the death was not suspicious. For some reason, they actually did release the photo, and tips started coming in about the tall blonde man. However, it was ultimately a police officer that recognized the guy in the footage. He knew it was Stephen Port. Stephen was arrested at his flat on October 15th of 2015. 3 days later, he was charged with 4 counts of murder. Media coverage on the case brought forth 8 other men who had been drugged and raped by Stephen. They would also file charges against Stephen, and all but one of those charges would stick. Finally, the evidence was getting properly analyzed, and it was all coming together. The suicide note was Stephen's writing on paper from his home, which was placed in a plastic sleeve also from his home. The bedsheet was from Stephen's bed with his DNA all over it. The IP address used by the John Luck Facebook profile was also traced back to Stephen Port. He would show up in court looking like a completely different man. The toupee he'd worn for 20 years was now gone. Apparently, the whole time he was in court, he never looked at the family members of the victims. The prosecution would call him a compulsive and habitual liar. Admitting lying to the police about the 4 deaths, he explained it by stating, quote, "The truth sounded like a lie, so I lied to make it sound like the truth." On November 25th, 2016, Stephen Port is sentenced to life in prison while the courtroom audience cheered and applauded. One person in the audience yelled out, "Scumbag," while another screamed, "I hope you die a long, slow death, you piece of..." I'll let you finish it. The public is extremely critical of how investigators handled this case. Some people feel like they didn't pay these cases enough attention due to class, gender, and sexuality bias. Police are now stating that they have new procedures and must make important changes to protect the public. They are also reinvestigating 58 unexplained deaths that appear to be related to date rape drugs as a result of Stephen Port's conviction. And 17 police officers are under formal investigation by the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Case cracked. Now, just to clarify, those other 58 suspicious deaths, they don't think that those are related to Stephen. However, there is some concern that they were looked over in the same manner that the deaths that Stephen was performing were also looked over. So it's a heartbreaker, and it feels like it's a very unfortunate growing pain of a police force getting used to a new culture. There seems to have been this overriding assumption by police that, well, this is just what young gay guys do. They're messing around with drugs and they're ODing and they're winding up dead all over the town. And that's a pretty bad and I think a bit of a sloppy assumption. Admittedly, in many cases I look into, some of them that are occasionally deemed as suicides, I have to scratch my head and ask, well, how do they rule it that way? How do they not look for more information? Shouldn't you at that point be trying to absolutely rule out foul play? And in these cases in particular, it's quite obvious that they weren't doing a very good job of truly ruling out foul play. As a matter of fact, if they would have just listened to the 911 call from the very first case when Stephen called it in, you could tell the guy's extremely nervous. His story's changing all over the place. First, he knows an address for where this body is located. Then they ask him later, and he's like, "Oh, I don't know. I was just driving by." Then when they actually interview him, he was like, "No, I was coming home from a shift at work, and I saw the guy in front of where I live." His story literally changes constantly, yet they just kind of took it at face value that, oh, well, looks like this guy just OD'd while he was spending the night with Stephen, and Stephen dragged him out to the street, left his bag with him. I mean, truly, truly horrible the way that these young men were treated, and I certainly feel for the families in these cases. One thing I do appreciate about this is how quickly justice seemed to move in this case. So at least they got their conviction, and he is spending life in prison, and apparently he will never have a chance to get out and do this again. So at least a bit of a silver lining to this story. Thank you all so much for joining me here on Case Cracked. Once again, thank you to Babel Froggy and her daughter for submitting this story. I hope you are all having a great day. Take care, and I'll see you back here on the Lord and Arts channel.